What is it like to wear a crown that's also a target? How do you command a nation when the person standing next to you might be hiding a knife? Is it possible to rule with strength when you know any public appearance could be your last? For some women in history, this wasn't just a fear. It was their daily reality. They were queens, empresses, and pharaohs who faced down assassins. And they didn't just survive, they used the attacks to become even more powerful. Number 16, how does a queen use a bullet to win her people's hearts? Queen Victoria was shot at 8 times during her reign. The first attempt happened just 10 weeks after her wedding. Her would-be assassin was an 18-year-old who bought the pistols for about £2. The pistols were so poorly made, they might not have even been lethal. Victoria was a young queen. She came to the throne in 1837 as a teenager. Many in the government and the public viewed her as a girl, not a monarch. They wondered if she was strong enough to lead an empire. Her marriage to Prince Albert in February 1840 was a national celebration. But it also put a spotlight on the monarchy. On June 10th, 1840, Victoria and Albert went for their daily carriage ride. It was a warm evening. They rode in an open carriage, a low phaeton, so the public could see them. This was part of their routine. They wanted to be visible to connect with their people. As they rode up Constitution Hill near Buckingham Palace, a young man named Edward Oxford stepped out of the crowd. He was standing about 6 feet away. He pulled out a pistol and fired. He missed. The horses startled, but the driver kept control. Albert saw Oxford pull out a second pistol. He reportedly shouted to his wife to get down. Victoria, who was 4 months pregnant with her first child, did not duck. She simply turned to Albert to see if he was hurt. Oxford fired the second pistol. Again, he missed. The crowd surged forward. They grabbed Oxford and held him until the police arrived. Victoria's reaction was what defined the moment. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She didn't demand to be rushed back to the palace. Instead, she ordered the carriage driver to continue their ride through the park. She wanted to show everyone that she was unharmed and unafraid. This single act of courage changed public perception overnight. The young, untested girl was suddenly a brave, resolute queen. People who had been indifferent to her were now fiercely loyal. Songs were written about her bravery, theaters gave her standing ovations, the trial of Edward Oxford was a sensation. He claimed he was part of a secret society called Young England that had complex rules and secret signs. The investigation found this was all a fantasy. His landlady said he was a foolish boy who liked to play with guns. The prosecution couldn't even prove the pistols were loaded with actual bullets. A witness claimed to have found a ball from one of the shots, but the evidence was weak. Oxford was ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity. He spent the next 24 years in a criminal lunatic asylum. This first attempt set a pattern. Victoria and Albert made a conscious decision not to hide. They believed that the best way to secure the monarchy was to be seen by the people. This was a risk, and the attacks kept coming. 2 years later, in May 1842, a man named John Francis tried to shoot her. On a Sunday, he pointed a pistol at her carriage, but it failed to fire, or he lost his nerve. He escaped into the crowd. Victoria knew someone had tried to kill her. Her advisors begged her to stop her public rides. She refused. She argued that if she hid, it would only encourage more attacks. She and Albert decided to set a trap. The next day, they went for the exact same carriage ride at the exact same time. They deliberately made themselves targets. They knew Francis would likely try again. This time, they filled the carriage with fewer ladies in waiting to give the police a clear line of sight. Plainclothes policemen were scattered all through the crowd. Sure enough, as they passed, John Francis stepped forward and fired. He missed. The police tackled him immediately. This time, the Queen had taken an active role in her own security. She had gambled with her life to catch her attacker. The public was astounded by her bravery. John Francis was tried and sentenced to death for high treason. But Victoria stepped in. She felt executing him would make him a martyr. She commuted his sentence to transportation for life. He was sent to a penal colony in Australia. Her decision to show mercy was just as powerful as her show of courage. It reinforced her image as a wise and compassionate ruler. Just a month later, a teenager named John William Bean pointed a pistol at her. The gun was loaded with nothing but paper and tobacco. He was sentenced to 18 months of hard labor. These repeated, almost amateurish attacks led to a change in the law. The Treason Act of 1842 was created. It made aiming a firearm at the monarch or attacking her in any way a high misdemeanor. The punishment was 7 years in prison and a flogging. The goal was to make these attackers seem pathetic, not political. It took away the drama of a treason trial and the glory of a death sentence. It was a clever legal move that took the power away from the would-be assassins. Victoria faced several more attempts in her long reign. Each time, she responded with calm and courage. And each time, the attack backfired on the perpetrator. Instead of weakening the monarchy, the attempts strengthened it. They transformed Victoria from a distant figurehead into a beloved and resilient symbol of the nation. She survived not just by luck, but by turning every threat into an opportunity to prove her strength and win the loyalty of her people. And number 15, what do you do when half of Europe wants you gone? Elizabeth I of England lived with a target on her back for most of her 45-year reign. Her spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, uncovered at least 6 major plots to end her life. The Pope himself, in a 1570 declaration, called her a heretic and offered a blessing to anyone who would remove her. She was a Protestant queen in a time of intense religious conflict. To Catholic Europe, she was an illegitimate ruler. Elizabeth's survival wasn't about dodging a single bullet or a knife in a crowd. It was a long, cold war of intelligence, counterintelligence, and ruthless political calculation. Her badassery wasn't in a moment of physical bravery, but in decades of mental fortitude. She built and trusted a machine of state security that was one of the most sophisticated of its time. Her greatest threat was not an angry lone man, but a rival queen, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was Catholic, and to many she had a more legitimate claim to the English throne. After fleeing Scotland, Mary was held as a guest in England for 19 years. This guest was actually a prisoner. Her presence was a magnet for Catholic plots. The Ridolfi plot of 1571 was the first major conspiracy. An international banker named Roberto Ridolfi planned for a Spanish army to land in England, for English nobles to rise up in rebellion, for Elizabeth to be captured, and for Mary to marry the Duke of Norfolk and take the throne. The plot was uncovered by Elizabeth's intelligence network. Coded letters were intercepted, messengers were captured and interrogated. The Duke of Norfolk was executed for treason. Elizabeth survived because her spies were better than her enemies' spies. But the most famous and intricate plot was the Babington plot of 1586. This is where Elizabeth's survival machine was on full display. A young Catholic nobleman named Anthony Babington planned to rescue Mary and assassinate Elizabeth. He and his co-conspirators were bold. They felt they were protected by their secret codes. What they didn't know was that Walsingham's network was reading their mail the whole time. The plotter sent letters to Mary, who was imprisoned at Chartley Hall, by hiding them in the waterproof stopper of a beer barrel. It was a clever system, but Walsingham's men had turned the beer delivery man. Every letter that went in and every letter that came out was first sent to London. There, Walsingham's master codebreaker, a man named Thomas Philippus, would carefully unseal it, make a copy, decipher the code, and then reseal the original so perfectly that no one would know it had been read. For months, Walsingham let the plot unfold. He wasn't just trying to stop an assassination, he was waiting for the one piece of evidence he needed to remove his queen's biggest threat for good. He needed a letter from Mary herself, explicitly approving of the plot to kill Elizabeth. In July 1586, he got it. Babington wrote to Mary, detailing the entire plan, the foreign invasion, the rebellion, and the dispatch of the usurper. Mary wrote back she was cautious, but she gave her approval. In the letter, she asked for more details and gave her blessing to their plans. Philippus, after deciphering the letter, drew a small gallows symbol on the copy he gave to Walsingham. They had her. Walsingham now had undeniable proof of Mary's involvement in a plot to kill the English queen. The trap was sprung. Babington and his fellow conspirators were arrested, tried, and executed. Then, Elizabeth's government moved against Mary. This was the hardest decision of Elizabeth's life. Executing a fellow queen and anointed monarch was a dangerous precedent. It was also her cousin. Elizabeth agonized. She delayed. She raged at her counselors for putting her in this position. But the evidence was overwhelming. The safety of her kingdom was at stake. In February 1587, she signed the death warrant. Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded. Elizabeth survived the Babington plot, not by being lucky, but by being patient and methodical. Her strength was in her trust of her spy master and her willingness to use the dark arts of espionage to protect her crown. She defeated her enemies on a battlefield of secret messages and broken codes. She understood that information was a more powerful weapon than a sword. Her reign was a masterclass in political survival. She outlasted popes, kings, and assassins, not by chance, but by design. Number 14. How do you fight an empire? By refusing to sit down. Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba was born in 1583 in what is now Angola. She lived under the constant threat of the Portuguese Empire, which wanted to control the slave trade and the region's silver mines. For nearly 40 years, she fought them. Her survival was not a single event, but a lifelong campaign of war, diplomacy, and sheer, unbending will. Her most legendary moment didn't involve a weapon. It involved a chair, or rather the lack of one. In 1622, before she was queen, her brother the king sent her to negotiate a peace treaty with the Portuguese governor in Luanda. The Portuguese wanted to make a point about power. When Nzinga entered the meeting room, the governor, João Correia de Sousa, was sitting in a large, ornate chair. The only other seating provided for Nzinga was a floor mat. In their culture, sitting on the floor before someone was a sign of vassalage, of being a subordinate. It was a calculated insult. The governor was trying to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. All his men were watching. Nzinga's entourage was watching. Everyone expected her to accept the humiliation. Nzinga paused. She looked at the governor in his chair and then at the mat on the floor. She did not speak. She simply gestured to one of her servants. The woman came forward, got on her hands and knees, and braced herself. Nzinga then sat on her servant's back as if she were a throne. She was now at eye level with the governor. With that single silent act, she completely reversed the power dynamic. She had refused to be subservient. She had shown the Portuguese that she considered herself their equal, using her own people as her source of power. The rest of the negotiation was conducted on her terms. She reportedly negotiated a brilliant treaty, securing the withdrawal of Portuguese troops and recognition of her kingdom's sovereignty. This moment defined her entire career. Nzinga became queen in 1624 after her brother's death. The Portuguese quickly betrayed the treaty. For the next 3 decades, Nzinga led her people in a guerrilla war against them. She was a brilliant military strategist. She learned to use the terrain to her advantage, leading small, fast-moving units to ambush larger, slower Portuguese columns. She was also a master of diplomacy and alliance building. When it suited her, she allied with the Dutch, the Portuguese's main European rival in the region. She welcomed runaway slaves and Portuguese-trained African soldiers into her army, strengthening her forces while weakening her enemy. She even adopted a form of Christianity for a time, using it as a diplomatic tool to gain leverage with the Europeans. But she never forgot the message of that first meeting. She was a ruler, an equal. She even took on the title of king instead of queen, wearing men's clothing and leading her armies into battle herself. She was known to be utterly ruthless when necessary, but also a clever and pragmatic leader who knew when to fight and when to negotiate. The Portuguese tried repeatedly to capture or kill her. They drove her from her kingdom several times, as she was forced to live in the wilderness, constantly on the move. But she never gave up. She would retreat, regroup, and attack again. She established a new kingdom at Matamba and continued the fight. She survived through constant adaptation. She was a warrior, a diplomat, a spy, and a politician. She played her enemies against each other. She used their own religion and politics as weapons. She outlived multiple Portuguese governors and saw the political landscape of Europe change. In her old age, she finally negotiated a lasting peace treaty with the Portuguese in 1656. They recognized her as the ruler of her kingdom, something she had demanded from the very beginning. She died peacefully in 1663 at the age of 80. She had spent most of her life fighting a superpower and had died in her own bed as the recognized ruler of her people. She had survived not just assassination attempts, but a decades-long attempt to erase her and her kingdom from the map. And it all started with a refusal to sit on the floor. Number 13, can a woman erased from history still be a survivor? Hatshepsut ruled Egypt for over 20 years in the 15th century BC. She was one of the most successful pharaohs in Egypt's long history. She oversaw a period of peace, prosperity, and incredible building projects. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri is still one of the most stunning architectural marvels in the world. And after her death, someone tried to assassinate her memory. This wasn't an assassination with a knife or poison. It was an attempt to completely erase her from history. The survival of her story is a testament to the work of modern archaeologists and the sheer scale of her accomplishments. Hatshepsut was the daughter of one pharaoh, Thutmose I, and the wife of another, her half-brother, Thutmose II. When her husband died, the heir to the throne was a young child, Thutmose III, who was Hatshepsut's stepson. Initially, she acted as regent, the traditional role for a queen mother, but within a few years she did something unprecedented. She declared herself pharaoh. She took on all the titles and symbols of a male king. In statues and reliefs, she was depicted with the traditional false beard and the male physique of a pharaoh. This wasn't about denying her gender. It was about using the established iconography of power. To rule, she had to look like a ruler. And for over 2 decades, she did. Her reign was a golden age. Instead of costly wars, she focused on trade. She sent a famous expedition to the land of Punt, likely modern-day Eritrea or Somalia, which brought back incredible wealth, incense, myrrh, ebony, and exotic animals. She built and restored temples all over Egypt. Her name and image were everywhere. She co-ruled with her stepson, Thutmose III. As he grew older, he took command of the armies, while she managed the affairs of state. It seems to have been a stable arrangement. But about 20 years after her death, something changed. Someone, most likely Thutmose III himself, gave an order. Workers were sent all over Egypt with chisels and hammers. Their job was to destroy every image and every mention of Hatshepsut as pharaoh. On temple walls, her figure was carved out. Inscriptions with her name were chipped away. Her statues were smashed and thrown into pits near her temple. The goal was to pretend she had never ruled as king. The official history was rewritten to show Thutmose III taking the throne directly after his father, Thutmose II. Her 22-year reign was to be a blank space. It was a thorough and systematic attempt at character assassination on a national scale. For thousands of years, it worked. Her name was forgotten. Later Egyptian king lists omitted her completely. She was a lost pharaoh. So, how did she survive? She survived because she had built too much. The assassins couldn't find every single inscription. In the dark, hidden corners of temples, her name remained. High up on obelisks, her image was too difficult to reach. And most importantly, they didn't find the pits where her smashed statues were buried. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists began to piece the puzzle together. They found the damaged inscriptions and realized someone's name had been deliberately removed. They discovered the pits full of statue fragments at Deir el-Bahri. Painstakingly, they reassembled them. The face of the lost female pharaoh emerged from the dust. The discovery of her sarcophagus and later, in 2007, the identification of her mummy through a single tooth brought her story back to life. We now know more about her reign than many other pharaohs. The very attempt to destroy her memory created a fascinating historical mystery that ensured she would be studied and remembered more intensely once she was rediscovered. Hatshepsut's badass survival wasn't a single act of defiance. It was the legacy she built. It was so vast and so solid that even a state-sponsored campaign of destruction couldn't wipe it out. She outsmarted her posthumous assassins by leaving behind a record carved in stone, a record so powerful that it re-emerged after 3,000 years of silence. Number 12, How Do You Rule After a Mob Tries to Burn You Alive. The year is 532 AD. In Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the city is on fire. A massive riot, born from anger at high taxes and political factions, has consumed the capital. The emperor, Justinian, is terrified. He and his generals are in the palace, planning to flee the city by sea. They are ready to abandon the empire. Then, one person speaks up. It is his wife, the Empress Theodora. Theodora was not born into royalty. She was an actress and courtesan from the lowest rungs of society. Her marriage to Justinian was a scandal. Many in the court looked down on her, but in this moment of absolute crisis, she showed more courage than any of the emperor's men. According to the historian Procopius, who was there, Theodora stood before the council and gave a speech that changed history. She told them that this was not the time to run. She said that she would not flee. She argued that it was better to die a ruler than to live as an exile. She ended with a now famous line, "Royal purple is the noblest shroud." Her words shamed the men into action. Justinian, inspired by her resolve, stayed. He gave command of the army to his most trusted generals, Belisarius and Mundus. While the rioters were packed into the Hippodrome, the city's massive chariot racing stadium, the soldiers sealed the exits. They then entered the stadium and put down the rebellion. It was a brutal and bloody end to the Nika riots. Tens of thousands of people were killed. Theodora survived the greatest threat to her husband's reign, not by hiding, but by refusing to move. Her courage in that single moment saved the throne. But her story of survival began long before. As an actress in the ancient world, she faced constant danger and public scorn. To rise from that life to the pinnacle of power required incredible intelligence and resilience. After the Nika riots, Theodora's influence grew immensely. She became Justinian's co-ruler in all but name. He passed no law without consulting her. She took a special interest in laws that protected women. She passed legislation that gave women more rights in divorce, prohibited forced prostitution, and gave women property ownership rights. She established a convent for former prostitutes, giving them a safe place to live. She was also deeply involved in the religious debates of the time. She supported the Monophysite Christians, a group that was considered heretical by the mainstream church. Justinian was an Orthodox Chalcedonian. This difference could have torn their marriage and the empire apart. But they managed to use it to their advantage. Theodora would offer sanctuary to Monophysite leaders persecuted by the official state church, which Justinian led. This allowed Justinian to appear orthodox while Theodora kept the loyalty of the powerful eastern provinces where Monophysitism was strong. It was a brilliant political balancing act. She was known to be ruthless with her political enemies. She was not a gentle or soft ruler. She had her own network of spies and was not afraid to have rivals exiled or imprisoned. She had fought her way up from the gutter, and she knew how to protect her position. Theodora faced down assassination by mob rule. She stared into the heart of a city in flames and did not blink. She survived because she understood power better than the men around her. She knew that to run was to lose everything. Her refusal to be a victim turned a moment of certain defeat into the foundation of a long and powerful reign. She proved that the most powerful weapon in a crisis is not a sword, but the will to stand your ground. Number 11, what if your dead husband shows up to kill you? Catherine, the Great of Russia, seized power in a coup in 1762, overthrowing her unpopular husband, Peter III. Just days later, he was dead under mysterious circumstances, likely killed by the supporters of Catherine. For the rest of her reign, Catherine lived with the shadow of that event, and her greatest threat came from a man who claimed to be the husband she had deposed. In 1773, a former army officer named Yemelyan Pugachev started a rebellion. This was not unusual. Peasant uprisings were common. But Pugachev had a brilliant and dangerous idea. He declared that he was not Pugachev. He was Peter III, the true emperor, who had miraculously escaped his assassins and was now coming to reclaim his throne from the German usurper Catherine. This was an act of political assassination aimed at Catherine's legitimacy. If Pugachev was Peter, then Catherine was nothing but a pretender. Many people, especially the poor and the Cossacks who felt marginalized by Catherine's government, wanted to believe him. The rebellion spread like fire across the Ural region. Pugachev was charismatic and bold. He issued decrees in the name of Peter III, promising to end serfdom, abolish taxes, and execute the nobles. He built a massive army of peasants, Cossacks, and ethnic minorities. They captured major fortresses and towns. For over a year, Pugachev's rebellion was a genuine existential threat to Catherine's rule. It was the largest peasant revolt in Russia's history. Catherine, in St. Petersburg, at first dismissed the news as a minor disturbance, but as the rebellion grew, she realized the danger. This wasn't just a rabble, it was an organized anti-government movement with a powerful symbolic leader. Her generals sent to crush the revolt were defeated, the rebels were brutal, and the government's response was equally so. Catherine's survival depended on her ability to manage a full-scale war while also controlling the political narrative. She had to crush the rebellion militarily, but she also had to destroy the idea of Pugachev as Peter III. She sent her best general, Alexander Suvorov, to take command of the army. The fighting was fierce, but Catherine also waged a propaganda war. She published manifestos denouncing Pugachev as an impostor and a criminal. She tried to reassure the public that the situation was under control, even when it wasn't. Inside her own court, she had to be strong. Any sign of weakness could encourage a new coup against her. She had taken the throne by force, and she knew it could be taken from her the same way. She continued with her daily work of governing, projecting an image of calm and control. She worked on her legal reforms and corresponded with French philosophers, all while a man claiming to be her dead husband was leading a massive army against her. Finally, in late 1774, the tide turned. The professional Russian army, better trained and equipped, began to defeat Pugachev's forces. His army started to disintegrate. Pugachev was betrayed by his own followers and handed over to the government. He was brought to Moscow in an iron cage. Catherine wanted to make a public spectacle of him. She needed to prove to everyone that this was not an emperor, but a common criminal. He was interrogated, tried, and sentenced to be executed. In January 1775, Pugachev was brought to a public square in Moscow and beheaded. The rebellion was over. But it had a profound effect on Catherine. It ended any liberal ideas she might have had about freeing the serfs. She saw the chaos of the uprising and concluded that Russia needed a stronger, more centralized autocracy, not less. She tightened the grip of the state and strengthened the power of the nobility over their serfs. Catherine survived a direct assault on her right to rule. She fought a ghost, a powerful idea that threatened to unravel her empire. She defeated him with armies, with propaganda, and with a will of iron. She showed that she was not just the German princess who had stolen a throne, but a true Russian autocrat as ruthless and effective as any man who had held the title before her. Number 10, how does a queen survive when her own people are the assassins? Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar ruled from 1828 to 1861. To Europeans, she was a tyrant, a monster. To many of her own people, she was a fierce defender of Malagasy sovereignty against foreign influence. Her entire reign was a fight for survival, not just for herself, but for her nation's independence, and the threats were constant, coming from Europeans, from rival nobles, and from members of her own court. When Ranavalona came to power after the death of her husband, she was not in the direct line of succession. To secure her throne, she systematically eliminated all her potential rivals. This was a brutal but effective way to consolidate power in a court filled with conspiracies. Her main policy was one of isolationism. She saw the growing influence of European powers in Africa and was determined to prevent Madagascar from becoming a colony. She expelled foreign missionaries, banned Christianity, and canceled treaties her husband had made with Britain. She believed these foreign influences were a poison that would destroy Malagasy culture and independence. This made her a target for European powers, particularly France and Britain. In 1845, a joint Anglo-French naval force attacked the port city of Tamatave, trying to force her to open the country to trade. Ranavalona's army fought them off. She defeated the European force, and as a message, she had the heads of the killed European soldiers put on pikes along the beach. It was a gruesome warning. Madagascar would not be conquered, but the external threats were matched by internal ones. Her rejection of Christianity created a new source of conflict within her kingdom. Many Malagasy had converted, and the queen saw them as a fifth column, loyal to a foreign power rather than to her. She persecuted them relentlessly. Christians were subjected to the ordeal of Tangina, a trial by poison where the accused had to swallow a toxic nut. If they survived, they were innocent. Many did not. This created a large, disaffected population within her own country. Her own son and heir, Rakoto, was a secret Christian convert. He believed his mother's policies were destroying the country. He and a group of Malagasy nobles, encouraged by a French businessman named Joseph Francois Lambert, planned a coup. The plot of 1857 was a direct assassination attempt on her rule, and likely her life. The plan was for Lambert to get the French government to support an invasion. The conspirators in the capital would then overthrow the queen and install her son Rakoto as king. Rakoto would then sign a lucrative charter giving Lambert and his partners exclusive rights to Madagascar's resources. The plot was elaborate, but Ranavalona had a powerful and loyal ally, her prime minister and commander-in-chief Rani Johari. He was suspicious of the foreigners in the court. He likely had his own network of spies. The plotters made a mistake. They tried to win over some of the queen's most trusted officers. Word got back to the queen. Ranavalona acted swiftly. She confronted her son, who confessed everything. The Malagasy conspirators were executed. For the Europeans involved, including Lambert, the queen showed a strange kind of restraint. Instead of killing them, which might have provoked a French invasion, she subjected them to a kind of psychological torment. She forced them to undergo a trial by poison, but used a non-lethal substance. Then, she banished them from the island, making them march through a malaria-infested swamp to the coast. Several of them died of fever on the way. Ranavalona had survived a plot orchestrated by her own son. She had faced down a conspiracy that involved both internal rivals and a foreign power. Her response was a mix of ruthlessness and cunning. She eliminated the local threat, but avoided giving the French a direct excuse to attack. Ranavalona ruled for 4 more years. She died of natural causes in 1861. Her reign was one of the most violent and controversial in Madagascar's history. But she succeeded in her primary goal. She kept Madagascar independent. It was not until more than 30 years after her death that the French were finally able to conquer the island. She survived by being more ruthless and more determined than any of her enemies. Number 9. Can you forgive the man who tries to kill you? Isabella I of Castile was one of the most powerful and consequential rulers of her time. With her husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, she unified Spain, completed the Reconquista, and funded Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. She was a devout Catholic, but also a pragmatic and steely-willed politician. And in 1492, the same year she achieved her greatest triumphs, she came face-to-face with an assassin's knife. It happened in Barcelona in December. The war against the Emirate of Granada was over. Columbus had returned with news of a new world. Isabella and Ferdinand were at the height of their power. The royal court was in Barcelona. As Isabella was leaving the palace after hearing a case, a crowd of people pressed in, wanting to see their queen or present her with petitions. From this crowd, a man lunged forward. His name was Juan de Canamares. He was a peasant who was described as mentally unstable and believed the king and queen had wronged him in some way. He pulled out a large knife, a kind of short sword, and struck Isabella on the side of her neck and shoulder. The blow was powerful. It knocked her to the ground. There was immediate chaos. The guards seized Canamares. The crowd, horrified at what they had just seen, would have torn him to pieces on the spot, but the royal guards protected him. They knew the queen would want him interrogated. Isabella was bleeding heavily. She was carried back into the palace. The doctors who attended her feared the wound was mortal. The blade had struck near her collarbone, a dangerous place. For several days, her life was in the balance. All of Spain prayed for her recovery. Ferdinand was reportedly distraught, rarely leaving her side. But Isabella was strong. She survived the initial shock and the risk of infection, a major killer in that era. As she began to recover, she had to decide what to do with the man who had tried to kill her. Her first public act was one of astonishing grace. She declared that she forgave her attacker. She asked that he be treated with mercy. This was a profoundly political act as much as it was a personal one. By offering forgiveness, she was presenting herself as a pious, Christ-like figure, a merciful queen in the mold of the Virgin Mary, to whom she was deeply devoted. It reinforced her image as a righteous and holy monarch, the Catholic queen. But Isabella was also a ruler responsible for justice and order. An attack on the monarch was an attack on the state itself. It could not go unpunished. While she offered her personal forgiveness, she allowed the law to take its course. Juan de Canomares was interrogated. There were fears he was part of a larger conspiracy, perhaps involving Jewish or Muslim sympathizers angry about the recent edicts of expulsion or a rival noble faction. But the investigation concluded that he had acted alone. He was declared insane, but in the 15th century, that was not a legal defense for treason. He was found guilty, and the punishment was brutal, designed to be a deterrent to anyone else who might contemplate such an act. He was subjected to a public and gruesome execution. Isabella's personal forgiveness did not save him from the state's retribution. This two-sided response was what made Isabella's survival so masterful. She used the attack to enhance her personal reputation for piety while simultaneously reinforcing the absolute power and security of the crown. Her recovery was seen by her people as a miracle, a sign of God's favor. The attack, which was meant to destroy her, ended up elevating her to a near-saintly status in the eyes of her subjects. She didn't just survive a physical wound, she survived a political threat, and in the process turned the assassin's knife into a tool for her own legend. Number 8. How do you fight an empire and become a Roman legend? Queen Zenobia of Palmyra ruled a thriving oasis city in the middle of the Syrian desert in the 3rd century AD. In a few short years, she transformed her small kingdom into a massive empire that challenged the power of Rome itself. Her story is one of incredible ambition, military success, and ultimate survival, even in defeat. Zenobia became regent for her young son after her husband, the king of Palmyra, was assassinated. But she was no mere placeholder. She was intelligent, educated, and fluent in several languages. She claimed descent from Cleopatra. And she had a vision for Palmyra, not as a Roman client state, but as the dominant power in the East. At the time the Roman Empire was in crisis, it was fractured and weak. Zenobia saw her opportunity. In 270 AD, she launched a stunning military campaign. Her armies, led by her brilliant general Zabdas, conquered Egypt, one of Rome's most vital provinces. And then they swept through Anatolia, modern Turkey. Within 2 years, Zenobia's Palmyrene empire stretched from Egypt to the Balkans. She declared herself empress and her son emperor, and began minting coins with their images, a direct challenge to Roman authority. For a brief period, she was the most powerful woman in the world. She had, in effect, broken the Roman Empire into 3 pieces. She ruled one of them. This was an intolerable situation for Rome. The Roman Emperor Aurelian was a tough, no-nonsense soldier. Once he had secured the western part of the empire, he turned his full attention to Zenobia. In 272 AD, he marched east with his legions. The war was swift and brutal. Aurelian's experienced Roman soldiers defeated the Palmyrene army in 2 major battles. Zenobia was forced to retreat back to her capital city, Palmyra. The city was heavily fortified and well-stocked. She expected to be able to withstand a long siege. Aurelian surrounded the city. He offered Zenobia generous terms of surrender. She refused. She sent back a defiant and mocking letter telling the emperor that she would only surrender when he was dead. She was counting on reinforcements from Persia to break the siege, but the Persians never came. As the siege dragged on, supplies in the city dwindled. And Zenobia realized her position was hopeless. In a last desperate gamble, she decided to flee. Under the cover of darkness, she and her son slipped out of the city on a fast camel, hoping to reach Persia and raise a new army. She almost made it. A Roman cavalry unit sent by Aurelian, who had been tipped off, pursued her. They caught her just as she was about to cross the Euphrates River. The warrior queen was captured. With their queen gone, Palmyra surrendered. Aurelian was initially lenient, but the city rebelled again after he left. This time he returned and showed no mercy. The city was sacked and destroyed. Zenobia's story could have ended there. Most captured enemy leaders were ritually executed during a Roman triumph. But Aurelian did something different with Zenobia. He brought her back to Rome for his triumphal parade in 274 AD. She was forced to walk through the streets of Rome, but instead of the rough chains of a common prisoner, she was famously bound with chains of gold and covered in so many jewels that she could barely walk. It was a spectacle. Aurelian was showing off his most exotic and famous prize, but it also saved her life. After the triumph, instead of being executed, Zenobia was given a villa in Tivoli, outside Rome. She was treated as a high-status exile. She lived out the rest of her life in Italy. Her daughters reportedly married into the Roman nobility. Zenobia survived the complete destruction of her empire. She lost her power, her kingdom, and her freedom. But she kept her life. In a strange twist, her defeat made her immortal. The story of the proud Eastern queen who dared to challenge Rome, her capture, and her final years as a Roman noblewoman became a legend. She survived because her conqueror saw more value in her as a living symbol of his victory than as a dead enemy. Number 7. How do you survive when your co-ruler is your greatest enemy? Cleopatra VII of Egypt, the last pharaoh, lived a life of constant political intrigue. Her entire reign was a struggle to maintain her grip on the throne and to keep Egypt independent from the growing power of Rome. Her enemies were not just Romans, they were often members of her own family. Her first major survival test came from her own brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy Shii. Cleopatra and her younger brother were married, as was the custom, and were supposed to rule Egypt together. But Ptolemy's advisors, a group of powerful courtiers, saw an opportunity. They tried to push Cleopatra aside and rule through the young, easily manipulated boy king. They turned her brother against her. In 48 BC, they succeeded in driving her out of Alexandria. Cleopatra was exiled, and her brother was the sole ruler. For most people, that would have been the end. But Cleopatra was not most people. She raised an army in Syria and prepared to march back to Egypt to reclaim her throne. This is when the Roman Civil War spilled into her kingdom. Julius Caesar, pursuing his rival Pompey, arrived in Alexandria. Cleopatra knew she could not defeat her brother's army and the Roman legions. She needed Caesar. But she was outside the city, and her brother's forces controlled the harbor. Getting to Caesar was impossible, so she came up with one of the most famous plans in history. According to the story told by the historian Plutarch, Cleopatra had herself rolled up in a carpet or a linen sack. A loyal servant, Apollodorus the Sicilian, carried the bundle past her brother's guards, pretending it was just some bedding, and delivered it directly to Caesar's private quarters. When the carpet was unrolled, the 21-year-old queen emerged. This was an incredibly bold and dangerous move. She was smuggling herself into a city controlled by her enemies to meet a man who could be her conqueror. But it was a calculated risk. She bypassed her brother's corrupt advisors and presented herself directly to the only man whose opinion mattered. Caesar was impressed by her audacity, her intelligence, and her charm. He decided to back her. He ordered Ptolemy to share power with his sister, as their father's will had instructed. Ptolemy's advisors refused. They laid siege to the palace where Caesar and Cleopatra were staying. A brutal urban war, the siege of Alexandria, broke out. For months, Caesar and Cleopatra were trapped, fighting for their lives against her brother's army. During the fighting, Ptolemy GE was killed. He drowned in the Nile while trying to flee a battle. With her primary rival gone, and with the backing of Caesar's legions, Cleopatra's throne was secure. She had survived an attempt by her own family to remove her from power. She did it not with an army at first, but with cunning and personal courage. The carpet incident wasn't just a clever trick. It was a perfect example of her political style. She understood power, and she knew that sometimes the most direct path to it is the most unexpected one. Her life continued to be a high-wire act of survival. After Caesar's assassination, she allied with Mark Antony. She gambled everything on him in his war against Octavian. This time, she lost. But her first great escape Smuggling herself in a rug to win over the most powerful man in the world remains the ultimate story of a queen who refused to be a pawn in someone else's game. Number 6. Can a single bomb change the fate of two kingdoms? On the morning of May 31st, 1906, King Alfonso GI of Spain and his new bride, Queen Victoria Eugenie, were returning to the royal palace in Madrid after their wedding. Victoria Eugenie, known as Ina, was the granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria. The marriage was meant to strengthen ties between Spain and Britain. The streets were packed with cheering crowds. It was a day of national celebration. As the royal carriage passed down the Calumet, a man standing on a balcony threw a bouquet of flowers towards them. Hidden inside the bouquet was a powerful bomb. The bomb, known as an Orsini bomb, was a type favored by anarchists. It was designed to explode on impact. It missed the carriage itself, but hit the crowd and the horses pulling the carriage. The explosion was devastating. Over 20 people in the crowd and in the military procession were killed, and more than 100 were injured. It was a scene of absolute carnage. The king and queen were inside the heavily built state coach. The force of the blast shattered the windows and splintered the wood, but the main structure held. They were thrown about, but were not seriously injured. The first thing Queen Ina saw when the smoke cleared was the blood on her white wedding dress. It was not her own, but the blood of a guard whose body was pressed against the broken carriage window. King Alfonso's reaction was immediate and calm. He helped his new wife out of the wrecked carriage. Her wedding dress was torn and stained. She was in shock, but unhurt. He stood tall amid the chaos, a gesture of defiance to the hidden assassin. Another carriage was brought, and they continued their journey to the palace, refusing to show fear. The assassin was a man named Mateu Moral, a Catalan anarchist. He had rented the room on the balcony specifically for the attack. In the panic after the explosion, he managed to slip away. A massive manhunt began. 2 days later, Moral was recognized in a village outside Madrid. When a local guard tried to arrest him, Moral shot the guard and then killed himself. The attack had a profound impact on the young royal couple and on Spain. For Queen Ina, it was a terrifying introduction to her new country. She was a Protestant who had converted to Catholicism to marry the king, and she was already viewed with some suspicion by the Spanish public. Surviving the assassination attempt earned her some sympathy, but the event cast a dark shadow over the start of her reign. For King Alfonso, the attack reinforced his belief that he was ruling a dangerous and volatile country. Anarchist and separatist movements were growing in strength. The bombing was not an isolated act, but part of a wider pattern of political violence in Europe at the time. Alfonso had already survived one assassination attempt a year earlier in Paris. He would go on to survive several more. He developed a reputation for being fatalistic and almost reckless with his own safety. He continued to make public appearances, often in open-top cars, seemingly indifferent to the risks. The survival of the king and queen on their wedding day was seen by monarchists as a sign of divine protection. But for others, the bombing highlighted the deep social and political divisions that would eventually lead to the Spanish Civil War. The badassery of their survival lay in their immediate response. They did not panic. They did not hide. They carried on with the day's events, presenting a united and unbroken front to the world. In the face of a terrifying act of violence, their first instinct was to perform their royal duty. The blood on the wedding dress became a powerful symbol of a monarchy under siege, one that would survive this attack, but would ultimately be consumed by the conflicts of the 20th century. Number 5, how do you outwit assassins in your own palace? Wu Zetian was the only woman in China's history to rule as emperor in her own right. Her rise from a low-ranking concubine to the absolute ruler of China in the 7th century is a story of incredible intelligence, ambition, and utter ruthlessness. For decades, she navigated the treacherous politics of the imperial court, where a wrong word or a misplaced trust could mean death. She survived countless plots, not by luck, but by being more cunning and more decisive than her enemies. She entered the palace of Emperor Taizong as a teenager. After his death, she was sent to a Buddhist convent, as was the custom for childless concubines, but she had already caught the eye of the heir, Emperor Gaozong. He brought her back to the palace, and her rise began. And she quickly outmaneuvered her rivals, including the existing empress, and became empress consort in 655. She was Gaozong's most trusted advisor. As he grew weaker from illness, she increasingly took control of the government. She was, in effect, ruling the empire. This made her many enemies. The traditional Confucian officials at court were horrified by the idea of a woman wielding so much power. Factions of nobles and members of the imperial family saw her as a threat to their own ambitions. Plots against her were constant. Wu Zichen's method of survival was proactive. She didn't wait for plots to mature. She created a system to root them out before they could become a threat. She established a secret police force. These agents were infamous for their use of informants and their brutal interrogation methods. They created an atmosphere of fear in the capital, but they were brutally effective at eliminating opposition. She also used a clever system of copper boxes placed in the capital. These were suggestion boxes where anyone from a high official to a common peasant could post a message. There were 4 slots, one for recommending talented people for office, one for criticizing the government, one for complaining about injustices, and one for reporting secret plots and conspiracies. This was a brilliant move. It allowed her to bypass the layers of bureaucracy and court officials and get information directly from the populace. It made her aware of discontent, and more importantly, it turned the entire population into a potential network of spies. Anyone with a grudge against a local official or a rival could report them anonymously and safely. Of course, this led to many false accusations, but it also uncovered real conspiracies. One famous story illustrates her methods. A group of high-ranking officials were plotting against her. One of their junior members was arrested by the secret police on an unrelated matter. Under interrogation, he revealed the plot to save his own skin. Wu Zetian had the entire group of conspirators arrested, but instead of executing them all immediately, she used the situation to her advantage. She offered pardons to those who would inform on others, effectively turning the plotters against each other and allowing her to unravel the entire network of opposition. In 690, after Emperor Gaozong's death and ruling for years through her sons, she finally took the ultimate step. She declared her own dynasty, the Zhou, and took the title of emperor. She was now the absolute ruler. Her reign as emperor was a time of significant change. She promoted talented people from lower classes, breaking the power of the old aristocratic families. She expanded the empire and promoted Buddhism as the state religion. She was a capable and effective ruler, but she never let down her guard. Wu Zichen survived for decades at the center of a web of intrigue. She was surrounded by men who believed a woman had no right to rule. She survived by creating her own power structure, one based on intelligence, fear, and a direct connection to the people. She was a master of political warfare, and she defeated her would-be assassins not in a single confrontation, but in a long, drawn-out campaign of psychological and political domination. Number 4, can you build a kingdom while dodging poisoned arrows? Isabella of France, who became the Queen of England by marrying King Edward II, is often remembered as the she-wolf of France. She is famous for leading an invasion of her own husband's kingdom and deposing him. But her early years as queen were a desperate struggle for survival against her husband's powerful and manipulative favorites. Isabella married Edward in 1308. She was a young, intelligent princess from the powerful French court. She expected to be a respected queen and a partner to her husband. Instead, she found herself completely marginalized. Edward II was utterly devoted to his favorite, a nobleman named Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was arrogant and ambitious. He treated the queen with contempt, and Edward allowed it. The king showered Gaveston with titles, lands, and jewels that should have gone to Isabella. The other English barons were also furious at Gaveston's influence. They saw him as an upstart who was poisoning the king's mind and mismanaging the kingdom. Isabella was in a dangerous position. She was a foreigner in a hostile court. Her husband ignored her. His favorite openly mocked her. She had no power and few allies. Gaveston's faction at court saw her as a threat. There were whispers and rumors. Any attempt by her to assert her rights could have been seen as treason. The political situation was a tinderbox. The barons twice forced Edward to exile Gaveston. Both times, Edward brought him back. The conflict escalated into a civil war. In 1312, a group of barons led by the Earl of Lancaster captured Gaveston. They held a quick trial and executed him. Isabella survived this first phase of her husband's disastrous reign by being patient and politically astute. She bided her time. She gave birth to an heir, the future Edward III, which strengthened her position. She slowly built alliances with the nobles who were disgusted by the king's behavior. After Gaveston's death, Edward soon found a new set of favorites, the Despencer family. They were even more greedy and ruthless than Gaveston had been. They accumulated vast wealth and power, and they saw Queen Isabella as their primary enemy. They worked to isolate her from the king completely. They dismissed her loyal servants and replaced them with their own spies. They even took her children away from her. By the early 1320s, Isabella was effectively a prisoner in her own kingdom. Her life was likely in danger. The Despensers controlled the king and the government. They could have easily arranged an accident for the inconvenient queen. Her chance to escape came in 1325. There was a dispute between England and France over territory. Isabella, as the French king's sister, offered to go to Paris to negotiate a peace treaty. The Despensers and King Edward, eager to get her out of the way, agreed. It was a huge mistake. Once she was in France on her home ground and protected by her brother, Isabella refused to return. She declared that she would not set foot in England again until the Despensers were removed from power. She became the focal point for all the discontented English nobles who had fled the country. In Paris, she began a public affair with one of these exiles, a powerful baron named Roger Mortimer. Together, they planned their revenge. They were not just planning to remove the Despensers, they were planning to overthrow the king. They began to raise a mercenary army. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a small force. The country rose up to support them. The Despensers' regime was so hated that almost no one was willing to fight for the king. The invasion was practically bloodless. The Despensers were captured and brutally executed. King Edward II was captured and forced to abdicate his throne in favor of his son. Isabella had survived years of humiliation and danger. She had been sidelined, spied upon, and threatened. She survived by escaping and then returned not as a victim, but as a conqueror. She had endured the poison of court politics and had returned with an army to cut out the source of the infection. Her badass survival was a long game of patience that ended in a swift and decisive checkmate. Number 3. What does it take to topple a madman? Christina of Sweden was one of the most unconventional monarchs of the 17th century. She was a brilliant intellectual, a patron of the arts, and a ruler who refused to conform to any expectations. She famously abdicated her throne in 1654, converted to Catholicism, and moved to Rome. But her life after abdicating was just as dramatic, and it included a chilling plot that she survived through sheer force of will. After abdicating, Christina was still a queen, just one without a kingdom. She traveled Europe with a large retinue and was treated as major royalty. However, she had ambitions to rule again. She saw an opportunity in the Kingdom of Naples, which was then under Spanish rule. She secretly conspired with the French chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, to become the Queen of Naples. In 1657, while she was staying as a guest of the French king at the Palace of Fontainebleau, she discovered that one of her most trusted courtiers, the Marquis Monaldeschi, had betrayed her. He had been secretly corresponding with her enemies in Spain, revealing the details of the Naples plot and mocking her in his letters. Christina was enraged. She felt this was not just a personal betrayal, but an act of treason against her as a sovereign. Even without a kingdom, she still considered herself to have the absolute power of life and death over her own subjects, which included the members of her court. She confronted Monaldeschi. She showed him the proof of his betrayal, his own letters. He broke down, confessed, and begged for his life. Christina was unmoved. She acted as judge and jury. She condemned him to death. The execution was to be carried out immediately, right there in the palace. She ordered her guards to do it. Monaldeschi was terrified. He ran to the palace chaplain, begging for a reprieve. He tried to get a message to the French king, Louis XIV, or Cardinal Mazarin, hoping they would intervene. But Christina's guards prevented it. They cornered Monaldeschi in a palace gallery. The execution was a grim and clumsy affair. The guards were not professional executioners. Their swords were not sharp enough. It took them nearly 2 hours to kill the Marquis. The news of the execution at Fontainebleau caused a massive scandal across Europe. The French court was horrified. Christina had carried out a private execution in a palace belonging to the King of France, as if it were her own territory. It was a shocking breach of protocol and sovereignty. Cardinal Mazarin wrote that if she had not been a queen, she would have been treated as a common murderer. Christina faced a storm of criticism. She was shunned by many, but she never apologized. She never backed down. She defended her actions fiercely. She wrote letters to Mazarin and others arguing that she had acted within her rights as a queen. Monaldeschi was her subject. He had committed treason, and she had administered justice. To her, it was that simple. Her survival here was not against a physical attack, but against the political and social fallout of her own brutal actions. She could have been imprisoned or expelled from France in disgrace, but her absolute conviction in her own royal authority, her refusal to show any weakness or regret, carried her through. People were shocked, but they were also a little afraid of this strange, formidable woman who acted with the certainty of an absolute monarch, even in exile. Eventually, the scandal died down. She was allowed to continue her journey to Rome. She had survived the consequences of her own ruthless act. She had faced down a betrayal and had responded with an assertion of power so absolute and so shocking that it left her contemporaries stunned. It was a brutal way to survive a plot, but it sent a clear message. Christina of Sweden was a queen you did not cross. Number 2, how do you survive your own family's ambition? In the late 18th century, the Kingdom of Portugal was ruled by Queen Maria I, but Maria suffered from severe mental illness, and so her son, the future King João VI, ruled as Prince Regent in her name. The real power behind the throne, however, was João's wife, a Spanish princess named Carlota Joaquina. She was ambitious, intelligent, and deeply resentful of her husband, whom she considered weak and incompetent. She believed she should be the one to rule. In 1805, she hatched a plan to make that happen. It became known as the Conspiracy of the Mafra. The plot was simple. She would have her husband, Prince Regent João, declared mentally incompetent, just like his mother. He would be removed from power, and she would be installed as the new regent of Portugal. To do this, she needed the support of the powerful Portuguese nobility. She began to secretly meet with a group of high-ranking nobles who were also dissatisfied with João's rule. She played on their fears and ambitions, promising them power and influence once she was in charge. She was a master of political manipulation. The plot was well developed. The conspirators had a plan to surround the Prince Regent at the royal palace of Mafra, where he was staying. They would force him to sign a document admitting his own incapacity and handing over power to his wife. They believed he was so indecisive and timid that he would give in under pressure, but they underestimated João. And they made a crucial mistake. One of the nobles involved in the plot got cold feet. He went to the prince and revealed everything. João was shaken, but for once in his life, he acted decisively. Instead of confronting his wife and the conspirators directly, which could have led to a violent and unpredictable confrontation, he used a more subtle approach. He arranged for a meeting with the papal nuncio, the Pope's diplomatic representative in Portugal. He told the nuncio that his wife was plotting against him. Then he summoned his wife, Carlota Joaquina, to a meeting. When she arrived, she found her husband waiting for her, along with the papal nuncio and the chief of police. It was a trap. João confronted her with the evidence of her conspiracy. Caught completely off guard and faced with the highest religious and legal authorities in the kingdom, Carlota's nerve failed her. She denied everything, of course, but the trap had been sprung. The conspiracy was exposed. João's survival was a masterpiece of quiet, understated power. He didn't have the plotters arrested and executed. That would have caused a massive scandal and destabilized the kingdom. Instead, he simply broke up the conspiracy. The leading nobles involved were quietly exiled to their country estates or sent on distant diplomatic missions. The conspiracy just dissolved. His treatment of his wife was the most interesting part. He could have had her imprisoned or exiled. Instead, he chose to keep her under his roof. They continued to live in the same palaces, but their relationship was completely broken. They were husband and wife in name only. Joao effectively placed her under a form of house arrest. She still had her titles and her status, but she was watched constantly and had no real power. He had survived a direct attempt by his own wife to usurp his throne. He did it not with swords and soldiers, but with clever maneuvering. He outsmarted her. He understood that a public scandal would hurt him as much as it hurt her. By handling it quietly, he maintained the stability of the monarchy and a facade of family unity, all while completely neutralizing the threat she posed. It was a quiet, almost invisible, but incredibly badass way to survive a coup. Number one, what happens when the people love you more than the government does? Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands reigned for 50 years, from 1898 to 1948. She was a stern, determined, and deeply principled monarch who became the symbol of Dutch resistance during one of her country's darkest hours. Her most profound act of survival was not against a single assassin, but against an invading army and a government that was ready to surrender. In May 1940, her country invaded the Netherlands. The Dutch army fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed. The government panicked. The commander-in-chief of the Dutch forces told the Queen and her ministers that the situation was hopeless. The government decided that the royal family and the cabinet should flee to London to form a government in exile. Wilhelmina was furious. She saw fleeing as an act of cowardice. She wanted to stay with her people to lead the resistance from Dutch soil. She argued fiercely with her ministers. A witness reported her saying, "I am not going, they can shoot me." She only agreed to leave when it became clear that her capture was imminent and would be used by the enemy for propaganda. She boarded a British destroyer intending to go to the southern province of Zeeland, which was still holding out. But enemy activity was too intense. The ship's captain told her he could not guarantee her safety. He could only take her to England. Reluctantly, she agreed. She arrived in London feeling defeated and ashamed. But what could have been the end of her reign became its defining moment. From London, Queen Wilhelmina became the voice of the free Netherlands. She used the BBC to broadcast messages to her people back home. These radio broadcasts, called Radio Oranje, were a lifeline of hope for the occupied Dutch. Wilhelmina was not a natural public speaker. Her voice was formal, and her language was a bit stiff, but her words carried immense power. She spoke with unshakable conviction. She encouraged her people to resist. She promised them that their country would be liberated. She reminded them of their history and their identity. To the Dutch people, listening secretly to their radios, the Queen's voice was a powerful symbol that they had not been abandoned. She was their government, their leader, and their hope, all in one. She became known as the only man in the Dutch government, a backhanded compliment to her resolve compared to that of her ministers. Her survival was a transformation. She went from being a constitutional monarch with limited powers to the absolute leader of the Dutch resistance. In London, she effectively ran the government in exile. She clashed with her ministers, whom she often considered too weak or too bureaucratic. She personally vetted agents to be parachuted into the Netherlands. She was a hands-on, wartime leader. This stance put a target on her back. She was a major enemy, a symbol of defiance. Her broadcasts were a constant source of irritation to the occupation authorities. She was, in essence, leading a psychological war against them, and she was winning. When the Netherlands was finally liberated in 1945, Wilhelmina returned to a hero's welcome. The Dutch people saw her as the mother of the nation who had guided them through the darkness. Her popularity was at an all-time high. The badassery of her survival was her refusal to be a victim of circumstance. She was forced to flee her country, an act that could have made her irrelevant. Instead, she used the only weapon she had left, her voice, to become more powerful and more important to her people than she had ever been before. She survived the death of her country's freedom by keeping its spirit alive, and in doing so, she ensured both her own legacy and the eventual rebirth of her nation.